Good afternoon and welcome to the live interaction with NITI Aayog. Today we have with us NITI Aayog member, noted economist and author Mr. Bibek Debroy with us. And hello sir. And this live interaction is part of a larger campaign called the Women Transforming India. This campaign has been launched by NITI Aayog in collaboration with the UN and MyGov in order to be able to seek stories and celebrate women change makers from across the country. As a part of this larger campaign, we today have this talk with NITI Aayog member Mr. Bibek Debroy in order to be able to address citizens' questions on a range of topics dealing with the new economy, women in the new economy, policy, legislation, and several other questions. Sir, we'll focus on questions that we've received from public directly on MyGov and also through several questions that have come on, which have been a part of media debates for a long time now. And some of these center around women, some don't. And so can I start begin?
Sure.
All right. So the first question we have is the sex ratio, child sex ratio in India has been on a decline, and from 927 females per 1,000 males in 2001 to now 919 females per 1,000 males in 2011. So we are more educated, we're becoming more aware, but still, how do we reconcile this? I mean, why is this sex ratio on a decline, especially among children?
Well, there are complicated reasons behind this, and after all, there's a legacy of son preference that goes into all of this. And it's also true that particularly if we distinguish between feticide and infanticide, it is by no means obvious that feticide declines as income level goes up. If at all, the evidence is to the contrary, that often increases in per capita income actually lead to greater incidences of feticide as opposed to infanticide. I think the right indicator to use is not the one that you mentioned, because that is the overall sex ratio. Mm-hmm. What one should look at is the sex ratio at birth. Okay. The reason I'm saying that is that the overall sex ratio may be adverse, but the sex ratio at birth gives us a better understanding of whether the initiatives to improve the lot of the girl child have actually begun to yield fruits. And the last comment I have to make is that we must be also a little bit careful in using the overall all Indian numbers, because there is a great deal of variation across India's states, and not all states necessarily have that strong element of son preference.
I mean, surely some states fare better than the others in these numbers. Okay. All right, so you think it's better to use an indicator which is right at the beginning?
That's correct. That's because it shows the impact that policies have had.
Do you think that's better? Actually, what is your understanding? You think?
No, you see, there are a couple of states that I know of where the sex ratio at birth is better than the overall sex ratio, okay. Which means the sex ratio at birth is still adverse, but it is less adverse than the overall one. And it is less adverse in 2011 as compared to 2001, which means that at least there is some impact.
Okay, sure. Okay. And the next question is about the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao campaign, which is sort of dear to the Prime Minister. And there is a criticism that a lot of this is, problematic because there's been budget cuts in the Women and Child Development Ministry, and there's been, is this then a symbolic effort, the campaign, or why is there, and this year there's no raise in the budget at least. So why is this happening?
No, I think a lot of people have been criticizing the union government without fully appreciating what has happened. And what has happened is a lot of money, thanks to the 14th Finance Commission, is now going as untied funds to the states. So if I'm going to look at allocations to the social sectors generally, including women and child development, I should look at the overall allocation, not only what is coming out of the union government budget. If I look at the overall figures, it's certainly not true that there has been any cut. The most substantive point is that, well, there are 2 points I want to make. Firstly, female work participation rates in India are very low compared to even countries in East Asia. If we had higher female work participation rates, we'd probably be able to increase output, national income, much more. So there is an issue with female work participation rates. There is also an issue with women being much more a part of the casual or informal labor force than the formal labor force. On the education side, which is how it started in a way, on the education side, the success rate is very, very palpable for primary education, because particularly for primary education, we have very, very high gross enrollment rates now in virtually every state in the country. The problem really is retaining them and the transition to the dropouts. And what I wanted to flag is much of the dropout problem is actually girl-centric. The dropouts are much, much more for girls. That's the reason the Beti Padhao is an important initiative.
All right. Okay.
My personal view is that if you are talking about democracy, democracy means that anyone who's elected is a tiny microcosm of what the country is like. So if a large segment of the population is illiterate, you'd expect the elected people also to be illiterate. Now, this issue was widely debated when we had a first general election. At that time, there was a great big debate about whether the electorate, not the elected, whether the electorate should only consist of people who were educated in some fashion. And the reason being, compared to levels of literacy, compared to levels of economic development, India was way ahead in terms of introducing universal suffrage. Now, linking this with what you have said, I am aware of what some state governments have done and have proposed to do, but I somehow think that this is against what is there in the constitutional principles, not legally, but in terms of the spirit of the Constitution, that we should not in any sense bar people at whatever level on the basis of educational qualifications. And you mentioned this being anti-women, but it would be anti any segment of society where there's a correlation between literacy or education and that particular community.
True, very true. This sort of question it deals with a question that a lot of women have been facing, is about the maternity leave, which was earlier 12 weeks and now has been extended to 26 weeks. The ministry, in fact, the Women and Child Development Ministry wants to push this to 8 months. While they say private companies are happy to adopt this sort of reform, but and the Labour Ministry sort of has its reservations. It's saying that, no, this could actually have a negative effect on women's employability. Is that true? Do you think that's true?
You see, look, we tend to look at several things through a gender lens, when the issue may have a gender angle, but using the gender lens may not necessarily be the best way of looking at it. What are we talking about? We are talking about an informal or unorganized labor force, where there are few labor laws. Even if the labor laws exist, those labor laws are not enforced because you cannot possibly enforce them. You've got an organized or formal labor market where you have formal rules, rights, which you can reasonably enforce. And the problem is that the twain do not meet. In any process of liberalization, the two will come closer together. Now, the example that you stated is an example that will essentially be applicable to the formal or organized labor market. A very small percentage, about 8%, where of course it will be a deterrent against future employment. But the problem really is with the unorganized labor force, where, as I said earlier in passing, a large number of women are members of the casual labor force. So I think what we need to address is the broader issues of bringing the two together, instead of going off on a tangent on maternity leave this and paternity leave that. That's a minor issue. The major issue is the big picture story is reforming labor markets and bringing them together.
Okay, fair enough. The Prime Minister had also spoken about women-led development and in the Conference of Female Legislators. And this is really a criticism that has come from several quarters about why then are we not talking about the women's reservation bill? Why, when it has already been passed in the upper house, when it was already an election promise that had been made, till today, why hasn't anything been said about the bill? And do you favor some changes in the bill and the form it has been introduced?
No. You see, look, firstly, the bill has been a demand. We've had reservations for other categories of deprived, marginalized people. So why should we not have reservations for women? So yes, that has been a promise. Yes, it should be made into legislation. However, do remember the point that I earlier made, that reservations, I think, are dysfunctional and inefficient, and quite often reservations can be abused by people. For example, in the panchayat elections, for example, it's not necessarily the case that in every instance reservations have empowered women. In some instances, the women have been figureheads. There are instances where women have been empowered, but not in each and every case.
All right. Okay. Another matter that has recently been a hot topic has been the Minister of Women and Child Development, Mrs. Menka Gandhi. She said this month in the Rajya Sabha that marital rape, as understood internationally, cannot be applied in the Indian context. Say whether in terms of education, literacy, poverty, given our myriad social realities, it couldn't be understood in that sense in this country. What do you think? What are your opinions about that?
Well, I have 2 or 3 comments on this. I think the first comment is the Indian Penal Code, which is really the core legislation, is very, very old. The Indian Penal Code needs to be completely revamped, not section this and section that, but all of it, not section 377, but entirely. We have a very serious problem with the definition of rape in the Indian Penal Code, even after the amendment. The third issue we have is changing legislation does not really help until you actually improve the efficiency of the criminal justice system. If I have a situation where the overall success in prosecution is of the order of 6% of the cases for which FIRs are lodged, then no system is going to be credible. So in the absence of improving the criminal justice system, even if I tinkered around and change the definition of rape to include marital rape, I don't think a great deal would be achieved beyond symbolism, because after all, it's a very large country, it's a very heterogeneous country. We are not talking only about the metros. Can you really imagine in the 606 lakh villages actually this being implemented?
People coming forward and actually finding cases or...
Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying that marital rape should not be included in a definition of rape. Of course, it should be. But just by doing that, let's not presume that we have solved the rape problem, because the rape problem is not a metro problem. It's a problem that pervades all of the country.
But it could be a step.
But a small, small step. It's a step that should be taken, but it's a very small step. We somehow tend to always pick on to small symbolic things and presume that this is going to solve the problem. Nirbhay will solve the problems of the entire country. It doesn't.
Okay, all right. So how do you see largely the role of women evolving in this new economy that exists today? I mean, how can women get greater participation?
Well, this is early days, and we are talking about a very, very heterogeneous country. If one accepts the premise, which is a valid premise to have, that many instances of poverty can be interpreted as being the result of asymmetries in information. You and I do not have access to the same kind of information, and I'm using the word information in a very broad sense. What the new economy does, what IT does, what smartphones do, which is exploding, is that it enables the poor to do a very faster rate of catching up in all of its different dimensions. And on the presumption, which is a valid presumption, that many women are poor, particularly women-headed households are exceedingly poor. So obviously it is a means for women in women's empowerment, economic empowerment, as well as social empowerment. But is it going to take off in all parts of the country at the same degree? Are the trajectories going to be the same? Clearly not. So let's not presume this. But certainly, in the sense of it being an anti-poverty tool, IT is therefore also pro-women in that sense.
Yeah, true. And what about entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs? I mean, are there measures that are being done to encourage women entrepreneurship?
But again, we come back to that same issue, that in this environment, once I've picked a sector, what can I possibly do to stimulate that sector? I would want everyone to have smartphones. I want everyone to have roads, water, and electricity. What can I especially do for women or to drive? Things like women's banks, I'm not really terribly convinced of what is so very great about a women's bank as opposed to improving financial inclusion for everyone. So if I'm going to stimulate women entrepreneurship, the only thing I can think of is what I hinted at earlier, which is that let's have even corporate income tax rates, personal income tax rates for women entrepreneurs. That's probably the only way you can actually drive it.
Drive women, more greater women's participation in entrepreneurship. Yeah, maybe things should be done, in fact. But talking about things like halving income tax rates, but given today's reality in the IT industry itself, there's a huge gender pay gap. There is that, the private companies are, it's a trend that has been noticed. So, how can we narrow this gender gap? Why, what do you think is the reason? How can this be narrowed? Especially at a time where CEOs are saying, don't ask for greater pay. Publicly, if they're able to say this, then.
I'm going to sort of muddy waters by saying that when you look at the gender gap in terms of salaries earned, there are huge methodological problems with what UNDP does in its Human Development Report, the way it computes that. So let's not use that as a benchmark. I know you didn't use that as a benchmark, you raised more of a general issue. This is not a problem that is particularly typical to India. It's a problem that exists in all countries in the world to greater degree or lesser degree. And this exists despite our having the Equal Remuneration Act since I think 1976 or something like that, because it goes back to the same issue. How do you enforce it? I think beyond what we have already talked about, one of the issues is the premium you place on human beings is a function of whether there's a scarcity or there's a shortage of human beings of either gender.
True.
India historically has had, within quotes, an abundant supply of labor. It's not going to stay that way.
Yes.
It's not going to stay that way. It's going to stay that way for another 10 years, 15 years. Give it another 10 years or 15 years, and you will find labor and people becoming scarce. They're already becoming scarce in the southern parts of India. And when that happens, you find better attitudes towards human beings in general, and you also find better attitudes towards women. Because, look, several of the instances that are happening in Haryana, part of them, we don't have time to discuss those, part of those are reactions to the fact that there is now a shortage of women in Haryana.
Okay, all right. But don't you see that somewhat as a function of patriarchy, even in this terms of...
Oh, no one is disputing that there is patriarchy. No one is disputing that. What we are disputing is, how do we address the issue apart from shouting from the rooftops that there is patriarchy? Of course there is patriarchy. So let us break that patriarchy by saying, well, the Hindu Succession Act was changed, but let us change it saying that inheritance should only happen for women. I have no problems.
Okay. There's an interesting question that we got from one of our sort of audiences on MyGov, and she's asking us, shouldn't we reorient the NREGA to include food processing, handicrafts, handlooms? In that it will also enhance living standards while also including greater participation of women. Do you think
this is easier said than done? This is easier said than done because the criticism of the MGNREGA has been it does not lead to creation of productive assets. That's been a standard criticism, and therefore there have been attempts to tweak it executively, but there is only a limited amount of tweaking you can do executively. After all, MGNREGA is an act. It's a piece of legislation, and changing a piece of legislation, given what has been happening in Parliament, is not very easy. So do I agree with what she's saying? Of course I agree with what she's saying, but I will extrapolate and say that it's not just about the example she's given, but to tweak it so that we have creation of productive assets. And the additional point I'd like to make is if we introduce the agricultural reforms and the rural sector gets transformed, then MGNREGS should not be necessary anymore. The numbers of people who offer the MGNREGS, that's a sign that there is prosperity in the rural sector.
Yeah, we're far from that
Yeah,
now.
far from that, sure.
Yeah. So, actually, coming back to the point that you'd made earlier about, information technology and women, India is often considered as a mobile-first nation. I mean, and this is also in terms of actually us questioning our own initiatives in terms of saying, when we're saying women transforming India and we're seeking stories and we want to celebrate women who are actually transforming India by using the internet as a platform and the media as a platform, the internet. Do you think we can actually involve women and include women through this platform? Do you think from across the country? Do you think that's possible? Do you think this is a way to go forward? Can this actually cause social transformation?
Cause social transformation because I'm disseminating the information
Awareness.
about how women have changed their lives, and because that dissemination of information leads to particular women acting as role models, and therefore others also.
Sort of a kind of
Yeah, and can I use
inspiration.
IT? I guess so. But the only point I made earlier was let the role models that one disseminates not only be the Kiran Bedis and the Mary Combs, because there are other role models
True.
whom we do not know about and we do not disseminate, who need to be disseminated much more, because a lot of people in India tend to identify with them much more.
Very true. No, actually, that leads us to where, I mean, we'll sort of end this discussion here because I guess we've run out of time. But we've actually been receiving a great number of entries from women from across the country through this, and very lesser known stories of where they've actually broken several stereotypes, and we're trying to celebrate those women, lesser known women. So this campaign ends on April 15th, and we'd like to invite a lot more participation from women across the country. Please spread the word. Send your stories on MyGov. We want to celebrate women who are truly transforming India. Very much for this interesting discussion.
Thank you. And I want to endorse that. Please send in nominations or whatever is the expression to use. The more we know about such instances, the better it is.
Great. Thank you.